Right, good morning to our second TAT. Good morning to cohort number 2. We're going to be taking a look at Israel's counter-testimony this morning, and we will also take a look at what that counter-testimony means for our understanding of this new section in the Old Testament known as the writings. What I thought I would do is maybe just spend some time just reflecting on a prayer. It's a prayer by Walter Brueggemann, and this prayer, I think, captures exactly where we're going to be going with this particular section and this particular tutorial. The prayer is entitled, "Not at Our Beck and Call." We call out your name in as many ways as we can. We fix your role towards us in the ways we need. We approach you from the particular angle of our life. We do all that not because you need to be identified, but because of our deep need, our deep wound, our deep love. And then we are astonished that while our names for you serve for a moment, you break beyond them in your freedom. You show yourself yet fresh beyond our utterance. You retreat into your splendor beyond our grasp. We are, by your freedom and your hiddenness, made sure yet again that you are God, beyond us, for us, but beyond us, not at our beck and call, but always in your own way. We stammer about your identity only to learn that it is our unsettling before you that wants naming. Beyond all our explaining and capturing and fixing you, we give you praise. We thank you for your fleshed presence in suffering love, and for our names that you give us. Amen. In many ways, this prayer by Walter Brueggemann captures exactly the essence of what we are dealing with in this particular section of the Old Testament. And here we're looking at Israel's counter-testimony. We understand, of course, that Israel has a core testimony, that core testimony reflects Israel's sense of stability in who Yahweh is. This is who Israel had understood Yahweh to be, based in their experience of Yahweh. But when we get to parts of the Old Testament, we recognize that not every part reflects the same core testimony. In fact, in this section of the Old Testament known as the writings, we pick up a number of points where the people of God are reflecting on a changing understanding of who Yahweh is, and in some ways therefore render a counter-testimony, a testimony that calls into question Yahweh's very character. And so this morning we're going to walk our way through Israel's counter-testimony as a means of setting the framework for understanding the Psalms and the Proverbs, for understanding the wisdom tradition, all reflective in some way or another, at one level or another, the variety of ways in which Israel bring their understanding of God to speech. And this is quite critical. What we are here dealing with, as we have been dealing with in the first part of Old Testament A, is Israel's testimony concerning Yahweh, and that the Old Testament is a reflection of a rich experience of Yahweh, both highs and lows, and that all of that is incorporated into the Old Testament. That's one of the most beautiful things about the Old Testament, actually. And so I want to now walk our way through a series of slides that will help us to better understand who God is through Israel's counter-testimony. So here we go. Counter-testimony, truth-telling in moments of absence. And what we deal with in this section is exactly that here Israel engaged in moments of truth-telling as a means of reflecting on God's absence in particular ways. Israel's faith, Brueggemann says to us, is a probing, questioning, insisting, disjunctive faith. Those are beautiful words. Probing, questioning, insisting, disjunctive. It may give us some point of reflection in our own relationship, in our own understanding of our faith. Is our faith probing, questioning, insisting, disjunctive? Nonetheless, this is what we find in Israel's faith. Here, the question Israel raises in its cross-examination, its counter-testimony, are not of a speculative or theoretical kind. In other words, what Brueggemann is saying to us is, Israel don't sit back in the ivory tower and then philosophize about what would happen if Yahweh was absent. These questions, these probings, these insistings, this cross-examination arises in a moment of concrete life experience. These questions, Brueggemann says, cohere with the very character of Yahweh as given in the testimony of Israel. That testimony to Yahweh has proposed a God who in majestic sovereignty provides a viable life order in the world through decisive, transformative interventions. Here we have a God who in generous compassion attends to the needs of Yahweh's own. But Israel's lived experience appears to deliver neither a viable life order nor generous compassion, certainly not by highly visible, nameable acts of intervention. In other words, what Brueggemann is picking up as we work through the Old Testament is that there are moments in Israel's experience when Yahweh does not show himself to be the majestic sovereign that we have known him to be. It raises questions about the very character of Yahweh because the lived experience in this particular moment betrays that identity. There are three different facets of Israel's counter-testimony. They reflect on hiddenness, ambiguity or instability, and negativity. And in some ways, what we are dealing with here is trying to trace out the various levels that are reflected within this group of books known as the writings. The first level reflects on the hiddenness, and in some ways this is problematic for Israel, but less so, as we will discover. We move down to level 2 to level 3. The deeper we go, the more negative the experience becomes. When we talk about hiddenness, we will unpack this in greater detail when we look at Israel's wisdom tradition. But you'll notice that at level 2 and at level 3, we start looking at questions of instability and negativity in the experience, and these become deeply problematic for Israel. Counter-testimony in the Old Testament revolves around 4 critical questions. These 4 questions become very helpful for us for framing the counter-testimony. And so in turn we will look at each of them and make a little bit more sense with reference to the Psalms, which is what we cover in this unit for this week. And so let's move to that then. The first question is the question, how long? And this question is raised when Israel knows that its lived experience is incongruous with Yahweh's intentionality. In other words, things are out of alignment. There is an incongruous moment in Israel's experience, and that Yahweh's intentionality does not seem to be the experience of the people. Israel fully anticipates that the God of its core testimony must and will act decisively to intervene and to transform unbearable circumstances, but that intervention, that transformation are not on the horizon. They are nowhere to be seen, which is why the question, how long, arises. The question is not a question to request information or a timetable. It is a restless insistence that amounts to a reprimand of Yahweh, who has not done for Israel what Israel has legitimately expected. So, for example, Psalm chapter 6, in verse 3, reads as follows. My soul also is struck with terror, while you, O Lord, how long? How long? Another example is Psalm 13, a familiar psalm to us perhaps. Verse 1, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? A repetition of that question, how long, how long, how long? And what Israel mean to do with that question is not to ask Yahweh for a timetable. Could you tell us when this is going to all sort itself out? The question is designed in the rhetoric to mobilize Yahweh to act in ways that are reflective of what Israel understands Yahweh to be based on its core testimony. This is how Yahweh is supposed to respond, to act, to intervene, and to transform those unbearable circumstances. And so the first question, how long? The second question takes us to the idea of why. And this question arises out of a circumstance of suffering that is senseless, especially in a faith where Yahweh is expected to be attentive and to be helpful, to hear the cries of his people. And so this question, why, is a question that does not ask Yahweh to give reasons or to justify the inactivity or the neglect. The interrogative, the question form functions rather as an accusation against Yahweh, who has failed, in Israel's experience, to be Yahweh's true self. So, Psalm 10, verse 1 reads, why, Yahweh, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Why? The question is an accusation. It is an accusation against Yahweh, who has promised to be present and in whose very character it is to be present, but is now noticeably absent. And when Yahweh is absent, bad things happen. Another familiar psalm to us, Psalm 22, reads as follows, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night I find no rest. Here, the words again are very powerful. They mean to bring an accusation against Yahweh, who is not visibly present, who is absent in this particular moment. We are familiar with Psalm 22 because it is this particular psalm that we find on the lips of Jesus as it is recorded for us in Mark's Gospel. There we read in chapter 15, Jesus crying those words, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that Jesus has these words on his lips is very important for us to consider. Jesus takes the Psalms as we are invited to take the Psalms and make these words our words. He makes these words his words. And he, in so doing, identifies himself with all those who continue to cry out that question, why? Why, God, are you absent in this moment? So question 1, how long? Question 2, why? The next question, where? The same issue, the same accusation are voiced with the interrogative, where? With the question, where? The spatial reference is not asking for information about where Yahweh's attentive love has gone. It is not asking for the GPS coordinates for where Yahweh has now located himself and is now allocating his love to another people. The point is that Yahweh's fidelity, Yahweh's faithfulness is not here. It is not in this circumstance of trouble where it is needed and where it has been rightly anticipated. This is a very important question. Israel asks again and again in their lived experience, where? Where? And it means to draw attention to the fact that Yahweh is not here. It is not information seeking. It It is not looking for where God may be, or where his love may be allocated, or where his generosity may be expressed. It is simply drawing attention to the fact that it is not here. So Psalm 42, verse 3. My tears have been my food day and night, while people say to me continually, where is your God? That question, where is your God? For the psalmist, the question isn't reflecting an interest in where God may be. The question accuses Yahweh of not being here, when tears are his food day and night, and where people continue to say in reference to him, where is your God? Right, a couple of other examples there. How long? Why? Where? Our fourth question is, this interrogative, this question, is not so much used in the way that we're considering it in this section, but one important usage is noteworthy for our purposes. In the book of Exodus, in chapter 17, verse 7, where we have the people in the wilderness, they're complaining, they are thirsty, they want water, and then the rock is struck and water comes from the rock. We pick up in verse 7, he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and tested Yahweh, saying, is Yahweh among us or not? The complaint is taken as a challenge to the leadership both of Yahweh and of Moses. It is an important question. Is Yahweh among us or not? And it is reflective of this very rich tradition of Israel's counter-testimony, which we need to wrestle with as we make sense of the books that belong to the writings. And so the purpose of these questions is, as we've already said, to mobilize Yahweh to be his best true self. The questions arise not in an act of unfaith, but out of a deep confidence that the God of the core testimony, when active in power and faithfulness, can prevent and overcome such intolerable life experiences. The questions arise with such urgency because Israel finds that life without the active force of Yahweh is not good. Israel will indeed tell the truth about its life, even if that life is costly to its testimony, but it does so in the expectation that this truth-telling will effectively summon Yahweh back to power and to solidarity. The core testimony of Israel, by appeal to these great transformative verbs of Yahweh and by the derivative adjectives and noun metaphors of Israel's speech, made a case that Yahweh is completely sovereign and utterly faithful. And on most days, the conclusion is adequate. It is a welcome conclusion because it issues in a coherent narrative account of reality. But Israel lives in the real world and notices what is going on around it. Israel is candid and refuses to deny what it notices. And so issues of competent sovereignty and reliable fidelity will remain in the Old Testament as Israel's belief-full, candid, unfinished business. Cross-examination does not proceed frontally or in large sweeping generalization. It is conducted rather by the slow, attentive process of teasing out detail, of noticing hints of incongruity that fly in the face of the main claims. As such hints accumulate, a rereading, a re-uttering of the primary narrative is required. That the cross-examination of Israel's testimony concerning Yahweh, in the end, requires a considerably revised narrative about Yahweh. This is what I find to be one of the most beautiful parts of Israel's counter-testimony, and I'm so grateful that this is incorporated into the Old Testament, because when we reflect on the beauty of these words and the beauty of this text, we are here encountering the fact that many aspects of life are brought to speech before Yahweh, and in our experiences of Yahweh, that experience draws us into a space where we must revise our narrative of God. So maybe to depict this in a pictorial way, as a way of saying there is a core testimony, that there are these lived experiences in Israel's life that raise questions about Yahweh's identity. And so this is what we're trying to draw attention to here in the diagram. So you will notice that Israel has a core testimony. Here at the bottom, Israel has a core testimony. That core testimony, let's just see if we can draw attention to it in greater detail. Right, that core testimony, as we've said, is made up with those nouns, the adjectives, the verbs of Yahweh. And that core testimony is exactly the bedrock upon which Israel lives out its existence. And so when an event such as exile looms large in Israel's imagination, Israel seeks to draw itself back down into the core testimony, and as it draws itself into the core testimony, it seeks to find their answers to the questions of why they may be finding themselves in these exile moments. These exile moments force Israel to resolve what is going on. There is an attempt on the part of Israel to resolution of one kind or another, a resolution that is deeply dependent on the reiteration of that core testimony, but that resolution doesn't always satisfy. So simply telling us that God is faithful all the time, or God is good all the time, God is good, in this context doesn't always make sense of the experience of exile. And so there are these moments of exile-like experience where Israel are brought evidence out of its own suffering that Yahweh's character as sovereign and merciful do not in fact always ring true. Yet, we notice that every single time in these exile-like moments, Israel do the same thing over and over again. They dig deep into Israel's core testimony to see if there is an answer there. There is a way of explaining the circumstance that they find themselves in. There's a reiteration of that core testimony in an attempt to respond to the exile-like experiences, but not always satisfactorily. And so the counter-testimony, this cross-examination, draws attention to the fact that not everything works the way that it should. Right. And so it is evident that Israel had to learn to live and to testify in contexts where the intense engagement of Yahweh simply was not available. It is profoundly important that this lack of availability did not lead Israel to retreat from its theological claims about Yahweh or to be silent about Yahweh. That is really, really important. That in these moments of abandonment, in these moments of where Israel experienced Yahweh as distant or not present or not responding the way that he should, Israel do not shy away from speaking theologically about God. They do not become silent about Yahweh. Instead, it leads them to venturesome alternative strategies of testimony. Yahweh was taken underground into the hiddenness and inscrutability, for example, which is what we encounter in the wisdom tradition. And what we encounter in the Proverbs, or what we encounter to talk about the Psalms, for example, is there is an instability and a negativity that is reflected in Israel's theological formulation. But for all of that, Yahweh, in indirectness and invisibility, is no less decisive. Indeed, it is in its counter-testimony. Israel used the occasion of Yahweh's hiddenness to magnify its claims for the generous, creative, and faithful governance of Yahweh. Yahweh is, in the face of hard evidence, said to be a practitioner and guarantor of joyous, life-giving coherence, the cause of all good and evil, the one with durable intentions for well-being in Israel. What Brueggemann is drawing our attention to here is perhaps more reflective of what we find in the wisdom tradition, but we'll work our way through some of these ideas as we make sense of this group of books known as the writings. And so as we bring this session to a close, we draw our attention to a couple of things that we need to wrestle with here. While Israel's answers about Yahweh might be less powerful than the core testimony, it is in any case important that Israel entertained the questions, honored them, and exercised great intellectual courage and great faith in making response. While the questions posed as cross-examination are nowhere answered, we may imagine the answers that arise. Where now is your God? Here and everywhere, but in ways that cannot be administered. How long? Until I am ready. Why have you forsaken? My reasons are my own and will not be given to you. Is Yahweh among us? Yes, in decisive ways, but not in ways that will suit you. And so this morning's session has been meant to really just frame this next section in the Old Testament, where we wrestle with this wide range of texts that draw a rich experience of God together for us. But as we wrestle with that rich experience, we also recognize that in many ways, what we are here dealing with are aspects of the experiences of God that we sometimes don't know how to file away. What I mean is, when we look at these moments, when we look at Israel's experience of God, where there is an instability in the relationship, where Israel seemed to be abandoned by God, here we are dealing with the aspects of God's character that we don't really deal with in the context of the church. Yeah, let me put it this way. When last in a worship service did you have psalms like Psalm 13 used as the foundation for our worship? Psalm 13 is a psalm of lament. It is a psalm that reflects deep disorientation, deep instability. And yet it is incorporated into this book known as the Psalms, which is a collection used in Israel's liturgical practices, in Israel's liturgical worship life. And yet it's there, but it seems absent in our own experiences. I'm really excited about this next section, because actually I think it has the capacity, it has the ability to unveil, to bring us into a space where we are beginning to move towards greater authenticity about our own relationship with God, where we are given the language to lead us into making better sense of our experiences before God. So this was our second tutorial for this module. There will only be one more, and that will happen in 2 weeks' time. Please do email me any questions that you may have in relation to your assignments or anything related to the work that we are covering. It would be great to get some feedback from you. Look forward to seeing you guys again. All the best. Goodbye.